Thank you all for joining us today and taking some time out of your busy days to join us on our webinar, Smackdown, Wrestling with Security and Compliance in the Cloud, Building the Foundation of a Secure Cloud Environment. I wanted to go ahead and introduce our speaker today, Trevor Horwitz. He's our CISO of TrustNet, and he will be leading the presentation. Trevor?
Thank you, Lawrence. Good afternoon, folks. I know most of you are on the East Coast, so good afternoon, and for those elsewhere, good morning. Welcome to the webinar, and again, thanks for joining us. We look forward to having a good dialogue. Throughout the presentation, feel free to go and message us with questions. The format for today is we'll be going through the webinar in about 50 minutes, and about 10 minutes at the end of the presentation will be left for Q&A. So in the next 60 minutes, we will explore the relationship between cloud providers and their clients by understanding the cloud stack. And we'll provide guidance on roles and responsibilities, who has to handle what, and what elements of the cloud stack are controlled by both the client and the cloud service provider. We'll also discuss the challenging questions that you should be asking your cloud service providers from both a business and a technical perspective. A little bit about TrustNet. We are a IT services company focused on security and compliance. We provide managed security. We do a lot of compliance work. We're a PCI QSA. Also have a lot of deep expertise with HIPAA, Sarbanes-Oxley, FISMA, and we also do SOC reports, also known as SSAE 16. The business was founded in 2003, and our head office is in Atlanta, Georgia. And we service clients pretty much all over the world, Australia, the UK, Europe, United States, Canada, to name just a few. So our agenda today, we've got 7 different topics we're going to talk about, and we'll kick things off and talk about what are the different cloud service provider models. We'll also have a discussion about who's in control, cloud service providers versus the client. We'll talk about the cloud stack itself, and we'll go through an analysis, all the different elements of the cloud stack. We'll delve into segmentation, which is actually a key topic, both from a compliance perspective and also from a security perspective. And then we'll provide you with a segmentation checklist. And that's a checklist that you should be using to consult with your cloud service provider and understand how the segmentation is actually effective. And then we'll delve into some of the business issues and also some of the technical issues associated with cloud service providers. So let's dive straight in and talk about some cloud service models. So the sort of industry standard is that there are 3 defined models for cloud service providers. The first one being the traditional software as a service, SaaS. Good examples of these are Salesforce and WebEx and Workday. And the characteristics of these applications are essentially they are running on a cloud infrastructure, and the applications are accessible from various clients' devices, thin clients, web browsers, or even a program interface. The next category of service provider is a platform as a service. And here good examples are companies like EngineYard and Cloud Foundry. The characteristics of a platform as a service is that there's a capability for clients to deploy their applications, whether those applications are created or acquired, onto the cloud infrastructure.
Entry and exit chimes are on.
Using programming languages, libraries, services, and other tools supported by the provider. So they act much like middleware in the software layer, and that offers features to developers, for example, security and clustering, in addition to, obviously, the platform itself. Moving on from there is infrastructure as a service. Classic examples here are Amazon's AWS, Google Compute Engine, and Microsoft Azure. And in this environment, the infrastructure as a service allows the clients to utilize a platform where they're providing processing, storage networks, and other fundamental computing resources And on top of that, the client would go and deploy operating systems, applications, and other software on the cloud infrastructure. So the use case for this is typically where you're completely outsourcing your infrastructure and basically just buying your compute power as a service. Next thing I want to talk about is who's in control. So one of the most important things to understand when looking at a cloud environment is that you as a client very rarely have any control over hardware. And that's almost a defining characteristic of a cloud environment. So you don't control the hardware. And in general, the type of control that you have will decrease as you go deeper into the stack. So for example, with the software as a service environment, you have very limited control, really only over user-specific application configuration settings. So, for example, in an environment such as Salesforce, you really only have control over your users, and that's basically your limit of control. In a platform as a service environment, you have a little bit more control because you have control over configuration settings, for example, application hosting environments. And then when it comes to infrastructure as a service, you have much more control because you can control the operating system, you can control storage, deployed applications, even networking components to some level. So host firewalls and other security elements are also in your control. So those are important concepts to understand in terms of how you're actually what level of the stack you're controlling. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the cloud stack itself and get an overview of this. And we'll spend a bit of time talking about this on this particular slide. At a very high level, we have the data elements. I'm not really going to delve into the data element. It's sort of self-explanatory. Underneath the data element, we have the API or the GUI layer. So this interface is what you as a client will use to interface with the applications themselves. And the most common API is a RESTful HTTP or HTTPS. And this will basically, with your interaction with this layer is done typically through a browser. The next layer down from that is the application layer. This is the actual application being used by one or more clients or customers of the cloud service provider. Next one down from that is a solution stack. Solution stack is typically the programming language used to build and deploy applications. Some examples for this will be .NET, Python, Ruby, Perl, etc. Moving on from there, we're talking about the next level is the operating system level. The operating system level, excuse me one second, I'm getting a bit of feedback here. Okay, carrying on from there. The operating system level, that's where you would deploy your virtual VMs. And alternatively, there's no underlying hardware, there's no underlying hypervisor present, then the operating system will actually run on the storage hardware itself. So that's really the OS layer. The next layer down from that is the virtual machines. And a virtual machines, you're talking about the virtual container, and that's a virtual container that's assigned to the individual client. This is a typical way that the cloud providers will actually provide that environment to you as a user. Next level down from that is the virtual network infrastructure, sort of self-explanatory. It's the network infrastructure but virtualized. And then the hypervisor itself. So the hypervisor is what is used by the cloud service provider to manage resources. And then this is responsible for managing the resources that are assigned to each virtual machine. It also may be used for leverage for implementing security, which we'll come to towards the end of the presentation, and we'll talk about the impact that the hypervisor has. The next layer down from that is the processing and memory, and this is the physical hardware that supplies both the CPU time and physical memory to the stack. Down from that is data storage, and now we're talking about the physical hardware that's used for file storage, Next level down from that is the network layer, and this can be either a physical or a virtual network. And this layer is responsible for carrying the communications between the system and possibly even between the system and the internet. And the very last layer of the stack is the physical layer, and that's the physical buildings and facilities and actual hardware where the cloud systems are located. So when you're looking at all of the stack, these are the elements to understand. And when we're talking about security in the cloud, we have to grapple with a security at every layer of this particular stack. So this is sort of something important to understand when you're going into a cloud environment. Okay, moving on from there, what we've done here is we've taken the cloud stack and we've mashed that up with the different service models. And the idea behind this slide is to demonstrate where the layers of responsibility and where the level of control exists within a typical cloud environment. So looking at the stack, we see that for on the extreme left here, we've got software as a service, our Salesforce model, if you will. And you'll see that there are really only two layers that we have access to, and we can control. That's the data layer itself, sort of self-explanatory, and then the actual interface, the API or the GUI. And those are the only two layers. Whereas if we look at the platform as a service, we have a little bit more functionality. Clearly, we have application control as well, and to the solution stack. And then lastly, infrastructure as a service, we have all of those above items. We have control over the operating systems, typically, the virtual machines, and even the virtual network infrastructure. What we typically don't have under all these scenarios is access to the hypervisor and anything below that stack. And that's where we have to understand that the level of responsibility for security comes into play, and the cloud provider really is the only one who can provide that. And that's where a lot of the concerns come when we're looking at a cloud environment. So even when you as a client don't have control over a particular layer, you still have some level of responsibility for the configurations or the settings for that particular cloud provider will maintain on your behalf. So for example, if you want to define firewall rules, then even though the cloud provider actually is configuring and managing those firewalls, you're the one who actually should be defining them. And this becomes very important when you're talking about an environment that interacts with payment card data, for example, or electronically protected health information. You can't absolve yourself of responsibility. You still have to be actively engaged, understand what those rules are, and manage them, even if you don't have full responsibility for actual implementation. So the bottom line here is you really need to play an active role in managing the security controls, regardless of who is ultimately responsible for executing them. Okay, moving on from there, we're going to talk about segmentation. So the first thing people always ask, well, what is segmentation and really why should I care about it? So the most important thing to understand about segmentation is segmentation is a critical control to ensure a strong and safe, secure environment, and has a particular role to play in a cloud environment. So within your own network, it's very common to segment off different parts of the organization. These are often done based on certain type of geographies, and often beyond that done on the job function. Say, for example, you have a human resource department. HR would typically be segmented off, so only they have access to their data within that segment. And likewise with, the financial folks in your environment, they also have their own environment. And this becomes very challenging when we're talking about a cloud environment, and there's a lot of issues that relate to this. So why do you need to care about this? This becomes a huge issue when you're dealing with compliance, PCI compliance, again, HIPAA compliance, and you need to take into account that the verification of segmentation can have a huge impact on the scope and obviously the cost involved in assessing those environments. So when we're looking at the question of segmentation, it's a critical function for both security and a critical function for security and compliance. So moving on from there, I've got a couple of examples here, and then we'll go through almost a little mini case study and we'll look at a couple of different scenarios, and then we'll talk about whether or not they would be acceptable as forms of segmentation. So the first example we've got up there is we have an application image on the same server, and that is segmented by both the OS, the operating system access control, or the application itself. Scenario B is we have different images of an application, but they're all residing again on the same server, and also segmented by the operating system or the application. And the third example is where we have data stored in the same instance of the database management system and data store. And in these three scenarios, as you can see here, not one of these scenarios is an adequate segmentation. And when I say adequate segmentation, I'm primarily referring to a compliance perspective, but you could say the same thing would be true for a security environment. So let's contrast that with these three scenarios. So in these three examples we have here, firstly, we have the traditional ASP model, where you have physically separate servers for each client environment. The next example is where we have virtualized servers and database servers, and these are dedicated to a particular client. And the last example is where we have applications in separate logical partitions with separate database management system images. And there's no shared data storage or other resources being shared. And as we can see in these examples, all three of these examples would be completely adequate from a segmentation perspective for this particular cloud environment. Okay, moving on from there, we're going to talk a little bit about segmentation in more detail. So this is something very important to understand when looking at a cloud service provider. And the cloud service provider has these grandiose claims. Yes, we're PCI compliant or HIPAA compliant, and we have everything fully segmented. So this checklist is something that you can use as for your own purposes in doing your due diligence with a cloud service provider, and really start to delve into each of those individual checkbox items to analyze what's going on here from a segmentation standpoint. At a very high level, if you can look at a sort of traditional network segmentation technologies, and these primarily consist of hardware devices. So hardware devices such as firewalls or switches, routers, so forth. Now, these physical components could be used to separate VMs hosted on the same or even on multiple hypervisors, similar to the manner in which systems could be segmented in a physical network. This would require the hypervisors with multiple network interfaces and configurations for the various types of network hardware. Additionally, virtual counterparts of these firewall switches and routers now exist, and they can be integrated and incorporated into the virtual environment. And that's really where the cloud environment has a completely different paradigm to the physical environment. So as we mentioned here, a key consideration is how these common layers, hypervisors and other shared physical components, whether they represent a potential attack surface between zones or between clients. So you as a user of these systems need to understand the intricacies of all of this, so that you can make sure that your cloud service provider is not inadvertently exposing you to some threat. So the answer to these questions in terms of an approach is, again, analyzing all of these things in detail, making sure they're well understood, and evaluating each one of these things all the way through. So a couple of things I just want to highlight here, some of the terminology you may not be familiar with. Physical firewalls, I mean, that's pretty much self-explanatory. Firewalls at the hypervisor and the VM level, and that's primarily going to be, it could be physical firewalls or it could be virtual firewalls. The next item we've got on our list here is VLAN tagging or zoning. This is a practice of inserting a VLAN ID into a packet header, and that allows the VLAN to identify, or at least it allows the packet to identify where that packet is being directed. So the VLAN understands its own identity. You can actually see this in certain switches as well, where certain ports are opened and the VLAN tagging is associated with that particular VLAN, and it prevents traffic from basically being broadcast across the environment. So this is another important component, especially when you have data that's traversing a different network, that both yours and other clients that are being hosted on a cloud service provider. So another critical thing, I think this is something that's typically overlooked. Another thing just to highlight here, which is the data loss prevention tools. We've seen the data loss prevention tools in the last couple of years gain a lot of momentum, and then it seems like things have sort of slackened off because a lot of the early promises really couldn't deliver. But this is something that's, again, to take into account when you're talking to your cloud service provider, what DLP tools they have in place and at what level. Are they at the hypervisor level or at the VM level? And we feel this is a very important control to have in the environment. Again, we understand that the tools themselves may not be perfect, but it's an important control to have in that environment and to understand where the data is going and how you're interacting with that data going forward. Another thing to highlight here, something that's typically overlooked, is the concept of two-factor authentication. This is a PCI compliance requirement. It's not specified within HIPAA that you have to have that requirement, but we feel this is another very important aspect. Having two-factor authentication and built into the cloud stack is important and allows you that confidence that it's going to make it that much more difficult for a hacker to get into the environment. And then there's some things on the back end as far as segmentation or separation of duties and administrative oversight. These are just smart questions to ask your cloud service provider. These are things you would have in your own environment and obviously need to extend there. And lastly, on this list, we've got logging and monitoring, and those, again, critical functions need to be performed. If you don't have that in your environment, you need to have that at the cloud service provider's environment as well. And that can become a crucial point when there's a data breach. We've seen clients that have had data breaches and they've got cloud environments, and the logging really just isn't available. So making sure that the cloud service provider is actually providing that level of logging that's appropriate for your particular risk factors is very important. Okay, let's move on from there, away from some of the technical things and start talking about the business issues. So this part of the presentation is really designed as part of your sort of due diligence when you're approaching a cloud service provider and start to understand some of the business aspects of how your relationship works. The first item we've got on this list is risk management. And clearly risk management in a cloud environment, most people will recognize it's fundamentally different, because when you're looking at risk, you no longer have the concept of, in the cloud environment, of a perimeter. The perimeter doesn't exist. You don't control that perimeter. The cloud service provider controls that. And that fundamentally changes how you approach risk, having effective firewalls and rules and boundaries around your network and trusted relationships. That a lot of that gets thrown out of the water when you're in the cloud. So the traditional approach to risk management needs to be adjusted. It needs to evolve, and looking at those areas where you need to focus more attention and understand, again, those boundaries. The boundaries are only one aspect of analyzing risk, but obviously when you're looking at your risk assessment, you need to take into account cloud service providers as well. The next item we've got on our list is the due diligence. So looking at due diligence, we're saying don't just do a cursory review of the cloud service provider's brochureware and look at what their glossies say. If they say that they're PCI compliant, you need to delve into saying, well, what does it mean, PCI compliant? How do you demonstrate PCI compliance? Who does your assessment? Is it a self-assessment? Is it a third-party assessment? Do they do a formal report on compliance where they need a QFA to do that? Those are the sort of questions that you really should be analyzing. I've seen clients or service providers, cloud service providers also say, well, we have a SOC report, SOC 1, SOC 2. And so the question is, okay, get that report, find out what type it is. There's two different types, a type 1 and type 2. If it's a type 1, it basically means that the assessor who did that test it really just looked at a point in time. You want the type 2, you want to delve into that a little bit more. You want to understand the nuances of that testing. And very important, within SOC reports, SOC 1 and SOC 2, there's a section in that report which is called user considerations. And those aspects are things that you need to look at to make sure that the cloud service provider's environment is going to be effective. Now, some of them are very intuitive, but there may be some sort of hidden things there you didn't realize were your responsibility in that environment. So due diligence is very important in doing really a deep dive into what it means when a cloud service provider says that they're compliant. The next thing to look at is your SLAs, or service level agreements. Oftentimes, the cloud service providers are very focused on uptime and high availability, but those are certainly not the only criteria. We've seen very little cloud service providers in the market talk about what their SLA is with regard to assurance or compliance or security for that matter. So where that delineation comes into it about whose responsibility is it for implementing security, this is where you need to delve into the SLA a little bit more and ask them to expand on what are their responsibilities, what can you expect as far as security. And part of that is also understanding what are the consequences for breaching that SLA. We'll talk about that a little bit in the legal considerations. The next item we've got here is business continuity plans and disaster recovery. Most cloud service providers have some BCP and disaster recovery, and they apply that to their environment. But again, you need to do an analysis of their plans. You need to evaluate, are they sufficient to meet your requirements? A business continuity plan is not something that's necessarily universally applied to every customer. One customer may need it to be done, within seconds. Another may need days or hours. It just depends on your environment. And it's a good idea also, to ask your cloud service provider, well, how often do they do testing? And see if you can if it's a small enough service provider, and see if you can observe that test and analyze it, or at least look at the test data of how they actually performed when they test their plans. There's very little testing going on in the marketplace with a lot of cloud service providers. So asking them, how often they test is always a good question, and can sort of help you understand how serious they are about their business continuity planning process. When it comes to human resources, you would do the same thing in your environment. And what we're talking about here is background checks. What sort of background checks, what qualifications do the individuals have who are running the environment? How competent are they? Just a good question to ask. Do they comply with legal requirements as far as background checks and criminal background checks, credit checks, etc. So the same risk factors that you have in your environment, you also need to look at the cloud service providers. They have people obviously working there who have different backgrounds, but you're taking on that risk when you're putting your stuff in the cloud too. Now, one of the important things as far as human resources goes is where the particular environment is located. And this we'll get into in a minute when we talk about legal considerations. But keep in mind that if your cloud service provider has operations in, say, an Eastern European country, the laws in that country may differ to U.S. law in respect to how they handle the data privacy, for example. So perhaps they're not that strict on data theft, and that can have an implication for you. Obviously, having strong laws can help protect you because there's a punishment element to the law. So understand, again, what their policies are, where their employees are located. Moving on from there into the whole legal considerations. So this is kind of a fascinating area for me because, as you can hear, obviously, in my accent, I wasn't born in the U.S. I was actually born in South Africa. So when we're talking about different legal systems, cloud service providers are growing globally, and they're often banding together and have operations in different geographies. And that can make a lot of sense from, locally being able to service customers, but also being able to shift production when you have heavy loads in one environment, being able to shift it to another. It's not unusual for cloud service providers to shift resources between, say, a location in Europe to the U.S. Based on availability of systems and maintaining uptime to when there are peaks and valleys. So that all makes all good business sense, but the real question is what happens if, where is your data and what happens to it at any one point in time? So laws obviously are different in different countries. The US, EU, and Canada all have very different laws on data privacy. Some clients who even specify that they only want their data residing in the US. Others say they only want it in Europe or only want it in Canada. We have a client that we're working with right now, and their customer has said they want all their data in Canada and none of it in the US for a variety of reasons, but basically it concerns the data itself is concerning Canadian citizens, and they don't want that outside of the country. So understanding all of those considerations is something that's important when you're looking at the legal consideration side. Another aspect of that is when you're looking at a potential data breach and you need data to extract data from that environment, or perhaps it's not even a data breach, maybe it's an investigation or some legal matter that's going on and you need to get data based on a court order, how easy is it to maintain the chain of custody with respect to that data, and what sort of tampering opportunities are there? You could inadvertently be, violating a court order because the data that your cloud service provider is providing you has some sort of filter on it. So when, again, analyzing these situations, do a deep dive and actually have a look at some of the audit logs and look from the cloud service provider and ask them these questions about where your data resides. Going to put you, in good stead when you do have an issue and legal gets involved. Okay, I know we got quite a few folks online here, and we're about at the halfway mark, so I'm going to ask you to go ahead and send us questions now. When we're delving more into the presentation, I'd like to have some Q&A and get some real dialogue going. So if you do have questions, please send them our way so that we can answer them at the Q&A section at the end of the meeting. Okay, the next slide we're going to deal with here also relates to business issues, and specifically we're going to delve into the data side of things. We spoke about data and where it resides from a sort of business point of view and a legal considerations, but let's talk about some other elements as far as data goes. The first thing we're going to tackle is talk about data acquisition. So data acquisition is essentially the process for how the data is actually input into the system. It also concerns operational data, perhaps your policies and procedures, system configurations, build standards, log files, audit reports, all of that data that's associated with the cloud service provider. These are all things that need to take into account when we're talking about data security considerations. So the data acquisition itself, here we're looking at what are the end-to-end processes and data flows that exist in the environment. And these data flows typically are things that should actually be mapped out and documented. As a QSA, whenever we're going into environments, it's one of our first tasks to do is to do a data analysis and watching where the data flows through the stack. And regardless of whether it's a PCI environment or a HIPAA environment, it's a great idea to go through and actually map out where the data flows go, what storage mechanisms they're using, and really delve into understanding about what environment you're getting into. And we'll talk a little bit about those considerations in a minute as far as what impact it can have. But again, end-to-end process, where does the data encryption, if they do have encryption, where does it begin and where does it end? The next element to discuss with your service provider is storage and persistence. For storage, you really want to make sure that you have a database structure. Obviously that needs to be encrypted if it's sensitive information. But there's other elements of storage outside of the databases where data may persist. These could be, for example, in VM images, backups, and monitoring logs. Oftentimes, you'll find that cloud service providers may have a particular issue with a build, and they'll port that data from one application into another VM, and basically just go and decommission a VM. The data associated with that may still exist on that original VM, and that's the sort of persistence that we're talking about, and that's something that needs to be addressed with the service provider. Again, you may not even know that it's happening, but there could be copies of your data in multiple places within that environment. Likewise, when it comes to backups, a lot of these environments, they're doing complete snapshots of that virtual environment. The whole virtual machine or the virtual database is being snapshotted. So go have a look at what are their procedures as far as how they do that, and what happens to their data. Where does it reside? Is it always online, or is there some other sort of off-site backup that the vendor's perhaps doing for you, or they're porting that into another environment as a backup? So again, understanding all of those things. The last thing as far as data storage and persistence I want to talk about is monitoring and logs. Very critical function, and this needs to be incorporated into every environment, not just for PCI and for HIPAA, although those are actually requirements that you have effective logging. But anytime you're looking at this environment, you need to understand about what's actually going on in that environment. This is, again, where sensitive data could potentially be stored. Often data leaks from certain files and lands up in a monitoring log. So understanding all of that is very important. And then as far as encryption and cryptographic key management, excuse me, from a crypto perspective, the encryption protocol that's being used needs to be very well understood. And likewise, what are the key management processes in place? So who is responsible for the encryption? Is this a function that's the cloud service provider is going to provide, or is this a function that you as a customer, you're going to provide that resource in-house and have someone on your team actually hold those keys? So that's the important thing to understand. And if they do have authorized key custodians inside the cloud service provider, understand what their internal process is. Do they have common keys across different boundaries, or does every client have a unique key? Those are some important considerations and things to ask your provider. In our opinion, it's really not acceptable for them to have a set of keys that are common. It needs to be a unique key for your environment, and you need to have access to that key as well. That's a sort of a preferred environment. But it's a very dangerous proposition to have a service provider who does encrypt your data, but they're using common keys. That means if the encryption key somehow gets cracked for one environment, the hackers can potentially use it across the entire environment. Very dangerous position to be in. And the last thing here as far as data goes is on decommissioning and disposal. We gave a couple of examples before, but essentially if you decide that this relationship isn't working, or you're moving from one cloud service provider to another, going to decommission that environment, what are the procedures involved for how that data would be disposed of? And you're looking for certain keywords here, such as secure wipe, that the vendor is going to, as a matter of procedure, will use a secure wipe mechanism to completely erase that data, and really get into the nitty-gritty, understand the technologies that they're using, the processes, preferably if they do have standard operating procedures, and they may even have this in their SOC report, delve into it, understand exactly what's going to happen, even down to the point of how many overwrites they're going to do, really make sure that they're doing sort of military-grade disposal of that data. And this becomes a very thorny issue in the event that you actually are terminating the services, where the cloud service provider doesn't really have an incentive to make sure these things happen properly. You're no longer a customer in their view, and therefore you're moving on. So make sure that you understand these things are going to be built into the engagement and into your service contract with them. And again, if there's a breakup, there's a divorce, make sure you guys are going to part in some sort of friendly terms, so you'll be able to go ahead and address these issues and not have an issue where data is still floating around your service provider, even though you're no longer using them. Okay, moving on from there, we're going to talk about some of the technical security considerations in this next few minutes. So the first one we're going to talk about is identity and access management. Everyone is familiar with identity and access management from your own environment. And again, in a cloud environment, it has a different connotation. Much of it is the same sort of controls you would expect, but something you need to understand from the cloud service providers, standard operating procedures, how they handle this. Essentially, the use of shared credentials is a big no-no. And that's something you shouldn't be having in your environment, and it's not something a cloud service provider should have either. So that's the first question typically you want to ask is, are you sharing credentials? And you want to make sure that individual users don't share credentials so that your environment itself can't be compromised by someone compromising a certain user ID, say an admin ID. So place very close attention to the system admin and maintenance accounts and look for use of single client credentials that cover multiple cloud environments because that's a potential concern. And with cloud accounts and also passwords, these should be unique for each service. In other words, if you have 2 or 3 different services within that cloud environment, make sure that they actually provide you with different credentials. Again, this is a security procedure. If you have multiple environments in there, you don't want someone accessing a potentially weak environment and being able to migrate and move into a secure environment because you happen to be sharing credentials. Also look at elevated privileges, system administrator accounts. These should be highly restricted for a specific service or a function and not used for general activities that don't require that level of privilege. Now, looking at operating procedures will give you a good idea whether or not the service provider is performing that function. Next one we're going to talk about is logging and audit trails. We touched on that earlier. Critical function. Oftentimes, the cloud service provider is the only entity that could provide that. This is not necessarily things you could provide yourself. Some of the logging and audit trails take place at a level below the stack where you have control at the network layer. So the cloud service provider needs to have an effective mechanism to provide that data to you should you need it. It's a requirement for PCI and for HIPAA that you keep the effective log trails and audit trails as well. So make sure you've got that data identified. Another aspect that we've seen as well in doing some data breach investigations, and that is that oftentimes the cloud service providers are really not segregating the log data. So they may have the data, but it's not segregated by client. And you end up having to sift through huge amounts of data to identify, well, which log entry actually relates to my environment versus some other client. A, that can delay the process of getting the data because the service provider doesn't want to provide all of the data to you, and B, or you have to sift through it yourself. So understanding their processes and making sure that they're segregating their data appropriately and you have access to it within a reasonable period of time is very important. On the hypervisor access and introspection, introspection is not something that everyone may be familiar with, so I'm just going to talk about that a little bit, and we'll talk about what the concept of introspection. So essentially, introspection is the functionality that allows the hypervisor to control and monitor individual VM activity from outside those VMs. So hypervisors, in a way, this is sort of like the pervasiveness of a hypervisor. The hypervisor introspection expands the functionality of the hypervisor to allow deeper analysis of the data that's being processed by the individual VMs, and this typically includes visibility into stored data files, as well as monitoring of network traffic, memory, program execution, and other elements of the VM. And it's a very important function in an environment. If you were using this in your environment and you had a virtualized environment, introspection is a critical function that allows you better control and visibility into those environments. But in a cloud environment where those VMs are being used by multiple different clients, the ability for that hypervisor to access all of those entities all at the same time is a potential threat vector. So when you're looking at that, make sure that you have access to the introspection logs for your environment, and even consider implementing data level security controls. And for example, like strong cryptography, maintaining that inside your organization, as we discussed before, because that would limit the ability of that hypervisor actually to penetrate that data itself. But just keep in mind that even if you do this, limiting the exposure of sensitive data to introspection through encryption, it does have its own limits. At some point in processing that data, it's always possible that your data is decrypted at some point, and as soon as that happens, any hypervisor introspection would enable that hypervisor to have access to that data. So again, depending on how sensitive it is and what sort of controls the cloud provider has, something to take into account and look at alternative mechanisms for securing the data. Another point on this whole hypervisor access, and keep in mind that the idea of the cloud service provider and how they can provide this service as cheap as they do, part of it is because they're doing it on a huge amount of clients. And because of that, a lot of these functionalities, like this hypervisor access, is pervasive across all these VMs. So the very tool that's providing the cloud service provider the ability to manage huge resources and therefore reduce the cost is also something that could potentially interfere with your security protocols. It's sort of a fine balance to figure that out, but it's definitely questions you should be asking your service provider in terms of how they go about that. And again, we spoke about logging, critical function. The hypervisor introspection logging is very important. The next section we want to talk about here is the security of interfaces and APIs. Again, in this environment, the APIs and web services are by their nature, they're publicly accessible. So their security is really critical to the security of your resources inside that environment. These APIs may not be properly developed. There may be weaknesses in them. You want to ask questions like, have they been security tested? Do the coders actually go through security training? How often do they test them? Do they actually do any penetration testing or application interface testing on these particular applications and the APIs themselves? So identifying all those things are good questions to ask. The last item we're going to talk about in this particular slide is the concept of multi-tenancy. And anyone who's familiar with the virtualized environment understands multi-tenancy. Essentially, in a cloud environment, each client organization should have no knowledge or doesn't have any knowledge of the other clients that they share resources with. So you have no knowledge about what other virtual infrastructure there is, what data stores there are. You don't even know how many clients are secure or insecure in their environments. It could be that there are unsavory clients who could be posing a risk to your environment, and that's basically largely based on whether the cloud service provider has done sufficient due diligence on their clients. You could have, a Russian mobster or hackers who decide to set up shop in Amazon and try and, penetrate that hypervisor layer and expose your data through that layer. So again, this is a good question to ask your cloud service provider. What sort of multi-tenancy approach do they have, and what sort of resources are being shared? One of the big no-nos would clearly be if you were sharing a database and you had your database on that and you had someone else's database data on that same database. That would be an issue, specifically if it was any sort of sensitive data. So make sure that the cloud service provider is actually doing some sort of monitoring function and looking for suspicious behavior. We've seen a trend now where cloud service providers will also go and actually vet their clients. They'll make their clients fill in business validation, understand how long they've been in business, where their business is located, how many employees they have, and really just validate that they're a real business and they're not some group of hackers figuring out how to take down the service provider themselves. Okay, so this is sort of our summary slide and what we've discussed today, and then we'll move into sort of a Q&A for the last, looks like about 10 minutes. What we spoke about firstly was the different cloud service provider models. We discussed the software as a service as a model, the infrastructure as a service, and platform as a service model. And each of those have different levels of control, which we discussed, and that implies that you as a user have a different level of responsibility when it comes to each environment. We spoke about the cloud stack, and within the cloud stack, all the different layers, the data layer, application interface, all the way down through the hypervisor and down to the physical layer. So understanding that cloud stack will help you better understand about what sort of control you have versus the cloud service provider and who's responsible for what aspects of that environment as well. We delved into segmentation, and we provided a segmentation checklist as well, and that's something that you can go and reuse and use when you're talking to your cloud service provider and ask them those questions. Who is responsible for example, the IDS at the hypervisor layer, if there is one? Who's responsible for different aspects of security, their internal procedures, get a better understanding of that. Those are all good ideas and a great checklist to go and use when you're doing your due diligence. We then discussed sort of business issues. We spoke about risk management, due diligence on a vendor. We spoke about SLAs and how SLAs shouldn't just include uptime, it should include security as well. We spoke about business continuity and human resources within that environment. And lastly, we discussed the legal considerations. On the data side, we spoke about data acquisition. We spoke about storage of data and persistence of data and how important it was to make sure that data wasn't persistent in other VMs that may inadvertently be lying around unused. We spoke about encryption and who should control encryption. Specifically, if you have cryptographic keys, you should have control over those, preferably, so that you can control who has access to the data and not the cloud service provider themselves. And lastly, we discussed the decommissioning and disposal of data and how you would handle that if you decided to terminate your relationship or move it elsewhere. And then the next item we discussed was the technical issues. We spoke about identity access management, logging audit trails, hypervisor access, introspection, and we spoke about the APIs and how those APIs should actually be tested as well. And then the last thing we just discussed was on multi-tenancy and what aspect of how those aspect of security comes into play in a multi-tenant environment as well. Looks like we've got about a couple minutes to spare, so I've got a couple of questions here that we want to answer before we sort of wrap it up. The first question I've got is, does a public cloud versus a private cloud, is there a difference? Well, clearly a private cloud, you're going to have a lot of the same sort of issues if it's a private cloud and that you would have in a public cloud, but the resources essentially that are managing that environment are different in a public versus a private cloud. So we've seen a trend now where certain organizations who've built up expertise in setting up clouds are now doing private clouds and setting them up mainly for large organizations so that they can have control over their environment. So there are differences clearly because based on who's managing it, but a lot of the risk factors are the same in both environments. No huge difference, and I think a lot of the things that we've discussed today would work well in that environment as well. You could apply this knowledge to any environment. All right, one more question here from, and we're going to answer. Give me 1 second. Let me get this together. All right, so the next question comes in from a user who wants to know, the question concerns PCI compliance and cloud service providers and how they should address that if they're considering putting payment card data in a cloud, and how they should address that with a cloud service provider. Paraphrasing a little bit. But essentially, the requirements for PCI don't change when you're talking about a cloud environment. Their responsibility still rests and accountability still rests essentially with the merchant. The merchant is the one who's responsible and has the direct relationship with the card brands for compliance. Your legal obligations don't change, but obviously this the technical and the business sides, which we've discussed at length, that will change in that environment. So essentially, if you are thinking about putting things in the cloud, there's some great guidance, and actually a lot of this presentation was based on some guidance coming out of the PCI Council. It's on cloud security and PCI. I was actually part of the special interest group that worked on that document. And so there's some good guidance if you do have a PCI environment and you want to understand about these elements. You'll see a lot of the information we've shared today is in that document as well. So that's a great resource, and it gives you some guidance. The bottom line of when it comes to PCI in the cloud is nothing really changes in terms of level of responsibility. You just have to address it in a sort of a different fashion. So with that, looks like we're just got right on time here at around 2 o'clock. So I want to thank everyone for joining the webinar. If you do have any questions about cloud security and anything we can help you with, my email address is up on the screen, and you can call our toll-free number as well if you're in the market or need any questions answered, or you'd like us to help you with any security assessments or cloud security assessments. You can also reach us at our web address, trustnetinc.com. So thank you, everyone, for being on the call. We appreciate your time and hope you found the session valuable. And if you did find it valuable, or if you didn't, please give us feedback. We appreciate both positive and negative comments, and we're always trying to learn and improve ourselves. I appreciate your time this afternoon. Take care and have a good day.